Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Vega Talks on 28 August 2020. This is our fifth Vega Virtual Talks for the year of 2020 since we've experienced the pandemic. Today's topic is business during a pandemic. I would like to thank each and every person that have dialed in for today's session and welcome to this healthy discussion we're having today. The structure for today will be an introduction. We will then go into the presentation and thought pitching done by the three speakers. We will follow that with a discussion. The discussion is made up of the questions submitted to the participants that have RSVP'd. We then consolidated the questions into three specific questions related to the topic, which we will ask the panel to respond to. And if time permits, we will allow for the participants to ask a question to the panel. I will, however, manage the time quite strictly. Just before we start, my name is Narita Pretorius. I am the facilitator for today's session, and I am the campus head here at Vega Durban. Usually Greg O'Day would join us in these discussions. Greg and I went for coffee the one day and came up with the idea of why don't we start a talk and discussion forum, and that's where Vega Talks then came from. Greg cannot attend today, but what he does, he's the editor and journalist of KZN Invest, passionate about things like cities, economic and social development, business, entrepreneurship and education. And he's also the author of the most recently released book, War Party. You're going to go have a look at his websites to get a better idea of what Greg does. Greg usually takes our conversations and interprets it into an article or some sort of thought piece that he then produces. We have three wonderful speakers involved today. I'm quickly going to introduce them before we go into the session. We have Kushli Belu with us today. She's the Insights Director consulting for Kantar. Quite a few people will know Kantar as a well-known research company. Kushli enjoys telling data-driven stories that inform marketing strategies that are commercially viable for the client's businesses, using human insights to feed into creative development. She's worked in research and insights for 12 years, including working across Kantar agencies, the biggest tobacco manufacturer, a French-owned alcohol manufacturer, and retail on the client side, conducting both qualitative and quantitative research. And maybe mention she also loves to cook. Kushli, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure. Lovely to cold Cape Town morning.
Unlike our warm Durban day. Welcome, Kushli. I'd like to introduce Kutsi Matibire. She is the brand director for Castle Lager and Castle Milk Stout at AB InBev. Kutsi started her career as a global management trainee at British American Tobacco with 14 years experience across several local, regional and global brands. As brand director, her key focus is on continuing the legacy of the Castle brand, leveraging consumer insights to develop compelling brand strategies and communications. Kutsi particularly enjoys bringing to life the brand purpose, bringing South Africans together, spearheading campaigns that unite South Africans and leverage the brand sponsorships of the national teams. What excites her the most, and you can see that in her personality, is creating work that resonates with consumers and ensuring that the brands connect with their audience in a meaningful way. Kutsi, welcome to Vega Virtual Talks. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Fantastic. And then our third speaker I'd like to introduce is David Blythe. David is also one of our advisory council members. He's the founder of Delta Victor Bravo and Africa partner for Eat Big Fish. David is an experienced strategy practitioner, having led significant brand insight, marketing, people, research, and technology projects across more than 20 countries. He founded Delta Victor Bravo in September 2018 and represents Eat Big Fish across Africa, Middle East. David's prior experience is as CEO of Yellowwood, MD of Enterprise IG or Brand Union, Group Head of e-business for De Beers, and MD of Tinderbox. He has previously held positions as chairperson of the South African Communication Design Council and the Digital Interactive Media Association, and is brand director of the Brand Council South Africa and the Johannesburg Ballet. He's currently very brave and enrolled for his MPhil in inclusive innovation at UCT GSP. David, thank you for joining us today and welcome.
Thank you, Narita, and thank you to everyone. Nice to
Thank you. Good to have you on board. All right, let's get into the discussion. First up, we're going to ask Kersley to present her take on business during a pandemic. Kersley, over to you, and thank you for the discussion.
Awesome. I think the topic is a really interesting one because I myself am a small business owner. Yes, I do consult to actually the biggest insights group globally, but I think a really exciting topic and very relevant. And I guess given my background and area of expertise, my view will largely lean onto a more data-led view driven by what we've been able to get from consumers. I will be referencing a huge global study that has been ongoing in over 50 markets globally, which specifically delves into COVID impacts. And the study was started in the middle of March, just as the pandemic started picking up globally, and we saw all of the impacts in European markets and the US as well. So it's been ongoing and very robust, and South Africa is one of the markets that's on there. So if we look at the chart that's on your screen, we see that South Africans are very worried if you compare to the rest of the world in terms of impacts of COVID to them. So that's the dotted line that you see on there. And you can see that it starts to decline over time. But what is interesting is that line starts to shift up again. I think looking at the June, around about June, and that's really driven by the fact that a lot of the cases started increasing quite sharply. So you can see the impact of those increases in the COVID cases on how South Africans were feeling in terms of levels of worry. Then what was driving the worry and stress for South Africans was mainly driven by finances. And the second biggest impact was the negative impact to daily life. And I guess when you look at worries about the future and concerns for health, those are continuing to grow. And I guess this is driven by the fact that we're all realizing that this pandemic is not going to leave us anytime soon. And it's really a matter of finding ways to live as normally as possible with the pandemic still in place. So, I think we all realize now that there isn't going to be a magical cure that's coming. And I think those future thoughts and how that's going to impact people long term are starting to come to the fore. When we look at shopping behavior from consumers, consumers are back in stores. So initially there was a sharp decline in people going to stores, but by May, levels were back to normal again. And if we look at the middle graph, which refers to e-commerce, those levels have stabilized. So there was a little bit of an increase in people shopping online. And I guess that's all the panic buying where we thought we were not going to leave our houses. But I guess the most interesting bit is the last third group of bars, where we see continuing increases and also sustained and beyond pre-COVID level, which is the use of cell phones to order goods. And for me, what's pertinent is that realistically in South Africa, cell phone is actually our version of online. So when we talk about online globally in South Africa, that really means mobile if we consider the mass market. So if you are a small business, the cell phone is a very powerful way of reaching consumers and getting incremental value out of them, especially if they cannot physically visit your store, if you have one, or also as a way of reaching people beyond the area where you operate. There are WhatsApp stores which are completely housed on WhatsApp, where the catalog is actually lives in the stories. And if you want to buy, the consumer would then send you a WhatsApp to conclude that sale. And if we think about it, you're really engaging with people who are at at least at consideration stage in terms of their shopper journey. So it's a really powerful way to connect with and communicate with people who are serious about making a purchase or a service that you're offering. And then the in-store experience has not been optimal. And this is also driving shifts in behavior. Some of these shifts are driven by government, regulation, but as some of them are sticking, and this is because of pure habit. So 82% of the people preferring to shop closer to home, 62% of people avoiding big superstores and big malls. And then the last one is really the one that I've highlighted is 48% of consumers have found that they have had out of stocks of the brands that they were looking for. And the impact of having out of stocks is that people start to use other brands that were probably number 2 or number 3. And this is driving a lot of repertoire use and dabbling with different brands. And there's a real chance that if your brand was number 1, is that the side dish now starts becoming the main course. So very important to ensure availability and visibility if you are selling products, just to avoid people finding an alternative brand or product over yours. And then the next chart really shows categories and purchases that were either made online, which is the dark yellow bar, that were bought offline, which is the light yellow, and the black showing categories that were not bought at all. And you see that for some of the categories, there's a high penetration of online purchases for them, meaning there's a little bit of a fragmentation in terms of communication. So there's a large proportion of consumers who aren't going to your physical stores. So if that's where you're advertising, they're possibly missing all of that. And those are things like clothes and food, which have a higher proportion of purchases online versus other categories. And then you've got things like dairy and household cleaning products and cosmetics, which are still for the most part being bought offline. And those are for practical reasons. And then in the black, you see categories that weren't bought at all. So tobacco, which is obviously driven by the ban on tobacco at the time. But what's interesting is that if you look at alcohol, it's sitting at much lower proportions of people that haven't bought, really alluding to the fact that there's either inelastic demand or there was availability of alcohol even in a regulated environments. And really the key reasons for people buying online were around avoiding health risks, the ease and convenience of shopping and delivery. So again, if you are a business owner, you need to find ways to break down barriers for your consumers to be able to shop you online or in times when they can't physically get to your store. And you saw that with Pick and Pay, for example. They partnered with Bottles to be able to increase penetration of delivery because from their side it took longer. So a lot of these were driving that high penetration of online purchases. And then I guess in summary, to summarize, from a consumer perspective, they are changing their shopping behavior driven by macro and micro impacts. So really important to monitor that as a business. There's also an appreciation of the simple and alternative ways of living. So a lot of it's driven by the fact that incomes have been cut, people have lost jobs, people have had salary cuts. So people learning to live with a little bit less, or at least the realization that people can simplify, and also, cooking more and incorporating exercise and mindfulness into their lives. We also see a resurgence of traditional herbs and medicines to treat illnesses. So at one stage, umhlonyana, or the woodworm plant, was trending and you couldn't find it anywhere in store. And people are starting to do small gardens and cooking foods that they only ate when you went home in December or over holidays because they are at home. So lots of micro changes in terms of behaviors, which is interesting to watch and interesting to see how that impacts your business. But also with that, it's not all positive and roses. People are time poor, a lot of pressure at work. People are, and consumers are saying they're always on. There's also fear driving this. So people don't want to lose their jobs. So there's a pressure to be always on. People are pulling 15-hour days. So convenience does matter to consumers, and anything that businesses can do to alleviate the pressure will be highly appreciated. And then we've also spoken about that acceleration of online shopping. And when we say online, it's really important that I stress that online in a South African context really means mobile. So making sure that your consumers can get there. And then I think lastly, just to round up for businesses, we always talk about, or we always hear, you need to pivot, you need to do all of these things, and no one really knows what that means in reality. But for me, it's really about businesses getting comfortable with dealing with the unknown and being ready to constantly adjust, because we will have to be adjusting as business owners and as companies. Secondly, take time to get your operational infrastructure right. So make sure that if your website is working, make sure your route to market is top notch. Make sure that your business development channels are in place so that there aren't operational barriers to overcome when there is demand or when consumers are wanting to access your services or products. Also be open to feedback from consumers and make it your job to understand their changing behaviors. What we did see with a lot of businesses is massive cuts on research because cost savings. We understand that that's important to monitor costs in a pandemic, but a lot of the times it's not useful. And it's really important to understand what those financial cuts mean for your business. So as a business, do not underspend on costs that drive growth for your business. So I'll make an example. If your sales team is the team that brings in business to your team, rather make cuts to marketing budgets rather than getting rid of the very same channel that brings you the business. And I guess the last point I want to make is that competitors aren't always who you think they are. So a lot of us and a lot of businesses define their competitor sets quite narrowly. So for example, if I am Woolworths, I'm thinking my direct competitor is Spar, it's Pick and Pay, it's etc., or whatever the example you want to use. But repertoires are increasing and people are changing and chopping brands very quickly. And I'll maybe make an example with beer in mind. If you are a beer brand, you may be competing with categories that you never even thought about. So if consumers were possibly drinking 5 of your brand, one of those might now have gone to, apple ciders that people are brewing at home, and another one of those 5 may be taken by a non-alcoholic gin brand. So it's really important to understand consumer moments, even outside of your immediate category, to avoid being blindsided and your market share being taken by a competitor you didn't even consider. And I think, yeah, stay woke, listen to the consumer. They are constantly talking to us, and that's it from my side.
Kuthli, thank you so much. That was very insightful. And just considering the questions that the participants have submitted with the RSVP, I am sure that some of those questions are beautifully answered with your discussion. Thank you, Kuthli. We're going to move into the next session, which is Kutsi's turn. Kutsi, over to you, and thank you for participating.
Thank you. Good morning, guys. I'm really excited to chat to you guys today. And what I want to focus my time on is my 5 top lessons about doing business in a pandemic. We've had 5 months of dealing with pandemic. It's definitely the biggest thing I've had to deal with in my career. I think for most of you, it would be similar. So I think the learnings keep coming. Every day is different, but I think for me, there've been 5 common themes over the last couple of months that I've taken out as my lessons, and I'm going to share these with you today. Number 1 is the importance of being adaptable and agile. Like, I cannot stress this enough. Speed to market is incredibly essential when you're dealing with a pandemic. I'll give you an example that we had to deal with. Suddenly alcohol was banned twice. We had campaigns developed. We had ads lined up. We had media booked. And, we had to move really, really quickly in order to make sure that we minimize our loss. But at the same time, it's also about moving together as an engine, right? So if I decide today that I need to pull an ad, I've got to make sure that my agency is on top of it. And they're going to make sure that the media agency is on top of it. You know what I mean? So it's just really, really important to be able to move quickly. But also, like, the consumer mood is shifting all the time, right? One moment people are doing certain things, the next moment something else has changed. So even when you're trying to create communication, it's incredibly important to make sure that we are creating stuff and taking it to market while it is still relevant. It's incredibly important to make sure that we don't put out communication that is outdated. The next big thing, and I think we're a creative audience and mostly, deal with brands and insights. I think it's incredibly important that we are clear on who we are. I always tell my team that, a crisis is never a good time to be confused about your identity, because everything else around you is in disarray. So in this moment, the one thing that you have, the one thing that you can lean on is your identity and who you are. Call it what you will, your brand positioning, your brand narrative, your brand essence. It all really amounts to the same thing, right? And this is who I am and this is what I stand for. And in times of uncertainty, this becomes your guiding light. Specifically for us as brands, I think there's a lot of pressure to jump into a conversation that is happening, or there's a lot of pressure to put out an ad or whatever it is. I mean, in those moments, your brand essence is the one thing that will tell you whether or not you should speak, but it will also tell you what it is that you must say, and I think it's my biggest learning has been that who you are doesn't change, even in a pandemic. However, what changes is how you express it. I'll give you an example. Castle Lager has been the sponsor of South Africa's national teams for over 60 years. We sponsor rugby, cricket, and soccer, right? But currently, we know for the last 6 months, these guys haven't been playing. That doesn't mean we don't sponsor them. We still sponsor them, right? But we've got to find ways to extract the value. Normally, our value would come when they were in stadium, people are watching the game on TV. But we've been under immense pressure to make sure we can still extract the value, in a different way. So so the point here is it's just about how do you still flex what it is that you stand for, in different ways to still be able to extract the value. Because I can't go back to the Springboks and say, well, you're not playing, give me my money back. You can't do that, right? I've got to find a way to make sure I still get value for my brand and I still get a return on the investment that I've made into the sponsorship. The third lesson is about being present. You've got to remain present. This one is a little bit of a contentious one, because COVID first hit. There was a lot of discussion around, should people be advertising, or what should they be advertising? And a lot of brands were pulling their ads, so much so that everything you were watching on TV was a Dettol ad or a sanitizer ad. But I think the important thing that we've learned is that you've got to remain present as a brand. You cannot go silent. And the work's been done. I think research has shown us that brands that remain present during a time of crisis actually recover at least 7 times faster than brands who go dark in their marketing and advertising. And I think what we've had to do as alcohol brands was really try and balance out that presence with the message we're putting out. So at the same time, we can't also be saying, here, buy Castle Lager, and the people can't actually buy it due to regulatory constraints, right? But at the same time, I want, as a brand owner, that when that person walks into the bottle store, my brand is still the brand that they choose. You know, it's still the brand that remains top of mind. So we've had to really balance that out. And how we've chosen to do it on Castle Lager was we've chosen to have responsible drinking messaging in this time to make sure that our consumers still think of Castle, but also we're sending out a really important message in South Africa, right? And it's this thing around alcohol abuse. So we've chosen to use this time and our space and our media placements to be able to put out a message that is incredibly important during this time in our country and specifically for our consumers. But I think the other thing as well, from a marketing point of view, is, you know, consumers also need that break in the timeline from the news is so morbid right now. There's so much negativity in the universe. And if our ads and our creativity can be the counterpoint that makes somebody smile, that makes somebody think about a time when things are normal, then we have to do that as the people that, you know, control these brands. And then my next lesson is around creativity. It's, you know, and I think because we're in marketing and advertising, people assume that creativity is something we do every day. Well, it should be, but it isn't always. I think sometimes we fall into the routine of we need to put out an ad, we need to put out this. But I think, you know, just really being creative is super, super important. It is the only way that your brand is going to stand out. You know, if you do work that moves people, then, you know, you get that earned media. And for me, you know, it's about doing work that moves me so much that I want to post it in my WhatsApp group. You know what I mean? I think it's going beyond likes and comments and shares on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. It's about the stuff that people aren't being paid to share. The stuff, you know, somebody said to me once that culture is what happens in your WhatsApp groups, right? If you think about the things that are exciting us or interesting us, it's the stuff that we press when you receive, you press for a share with your group. And I think one of these days, what I'm looking forward to is to being able to measure that, because currently, yeah, we get the stats on Twitter and Facebook, but we don't know, you know, to what extent some of the content is being shared. And this brings me to my favorite ad in the last couple of months, which has been the Chicken Licken ad. And I'm hoping that most of you have seen it. But it's an ad, Soulful Nation, that they put out about a month ago. And basically, the good thing about this ad is, first of all, it came at a time when there was so much tension. We were all sitting at home and tired of what felt like a never-ending lockdown. And Chicken Licken found a way to make us laugh. They found a way to use a lot of the experiences over the last couple of months to really make South Africa laugh and remind us that, you know what, there's light at the end of the tunnel and that life isn't as serious as we take it. And this ad, I've never seen this ad on TV, but for at least a week, it was shared in every WhatsApp group I was on. It was shared on every social media platform. So for the brand, you get so much awareness because you've tapped into something that is resonating with consumers, and you've tapped into something that makes them laugh. It's also like a welcome break on what tends to be sad news on the timeline. I think as South Africans, we love making fun of ourselves, and this ad really tapped into that in such a cool way, but most importantly, in a way that's authentic to Chicken Licken, right? It's not like they randomly just made a funny ad. This is in keeping with what the brand stands for, and they found a really cool way to activate that. And then my final lesson, which is something that Kuhle actually alluded to in her closing remarks, is around staying close to the consumer. You know, you've got to stay plugged in. You need to keep a handle on the changing consumer needs and behavior. I think if I've learned anything in the last couple of months is that our behaviors have shifted in a lot of ways, in how we communicate, in how we handle our relationships with others, and how we handle our relationships with different products. You know, so if I am going through that change, at best, you know, I believe that consumers are going through the same kind of change. And what's important for us, we always say in our business that it's important to make sure that you are solving a pain point for the consumer. Like, what role does your brand play in somebody's life? You know, I don't think consumers wake up and say, oh my God, I wonder what Castle has to say today. You know, let me go and see what's happening on the Castle Facebook page. It doesn't happen like that. We need to find a way to make sure we carve out a clear role in our consumers' lives. And if we do that, then we remain indispensable. But also part of that is acknowledging that that role is changing because the world is going through, like a really, really big change at the moment. And so consumer behavior is shifting. If I think about myself, Kutle spoke about it. I haven't set foot inside a Woolworths in maybe 2 months. It started off as trying to limit my exposure, and I started ordering my groceries on Zulzi online. And then after a couple of weeks, I was like, this is convenient. I don't have the time. I don't have to deal with all of this. I can do this. And for me, that's something that's become a lifestyle shift. Not to say I'll never go to a Woolies again. I will. But for now, I'm okay with not going. And I think, even post the pandemic, it's something that I'm going to continue because it is just so convenient. But what frustrates me as a consumer is when I'm in Woolies, I see all the special. I'm a bargain shopper, right? So when I'm in Woolies, I see all the special. But when I shop online, I feel a little bit cheated because I'm not getting those benefits. And the challenge for brands is how do you bring that shop, in-store experience online so that me as your shopper can continue to experience the same thing or can continue to experience the same kind of brand promise. And I just want to give you guys an example around just being plugged in and tapping into what your consumers needs. We spoke about the rise in online shopping. We've had to, beer was never something that you could order on Take-A-Lot or online with minimal problems, But because we acknowledge the fact that our consumer behaviors are shifting, everyone is buying everything online. We've had to also acknowledge that and make sure we meet that demand. So you can now buy Castle Lager, Castle Light, Castle Milk Stout on Take-A-Lot because we acknowledge that our consumers have moved, they've shifted, right? No one wants to stand in those long queues you see at Tops. And so Take-A-Lot provides our consumers with a really convenient way to buy their beer. But having said that, we've also had to acknowledge that not every consumer of ours has a credit card, right? The bottom end of our consumer, the bottom end of our market actually doesn't always have a credit card. They can't wait 2 or 3 days for their Take-A-Lot order to be delivered because a lot of them are buying their beer for immediate consumption. And for those guys, they also still don't want to go to the shops, right? Or they don't want to, they also want to limit the exposure. So we've had to be quite creative in terms of how we take our products to them. And what I'm most proud of is, one of the things we've developed is a USSD click and collect solution for our bottom end consumers. We know they don't have a lot of data, so an app was never going to work. So we had to use USSD, which is data light. And it's click and collect because then you can order and you don't need a credit card. You can quickly go fetch your beer within an hour or maximum 2 because we know that you're ordering your beer because you want it. So it's just about really being plugged in and keeping an eye on those consumer behaviors, seeing how they're shifting and making sure that your brand is best placed to continue to meet those consumer needs. And then to wrap up, I just want to just summarize all of that. I think for me, there's been a number of lessons in this lockdown, but I think these 5 for me have really served me well, and I hope we all never have to deal with another pandemic. But I feel like if we had to, just being clear on who you are as a brand, being present and remaining top of mind for your consumer, being super creative so that the work that you do moves people, being agile because you're going to move quickly. And lastly, it's important to stay plugged in and close to your consumer and to know and understand how their behaviors are shifting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kutsi. I think the audience was quite curious to hear from you, especially in the position that you are and relevant to a brand that possibly firsthand experienced what limitations, parameters, and regulation, would do to a brand. Thank you for sharing your 5 key points with us. And I'm going to move into David's session now. David, we look forward to hearing from you too. Over to you.
Thank you, Nareta. Thank you very much for the kind introduction earlier. And hello to everyone on the call. I'm going to start with a slightly humorous perspective on the polarized response to the new normal, which is this odd term that emerged during the crisis. And we saw many consultants changing the language to call it the next normal. And perhaps that's because it's less of a paradox and maybe more sequential, but probably more likely because it allows them to talk about all things innovation and digital disruption, etc. And that's what I've seen in a lot of their content. But on the other side of the spectrum, we also have many other consultants calling this absolute nonsense. And I refer specifically to a gentleman, very outspoken individual, Mark Ritson, who called this, this term, the new normal, the fever dreams driven by the aspiration of the writer. And I guess we all know that given the dynamics and variables and interdependencies at play inside our own businesses, that the answer actually lies somewhere in between. And depending on what kind of industry or category you're in, you might fall further to the left or further to the right of the spectrum. But given that assessment, I picked 3 challenges which I think are really important to highlight as being faced by business during any kind of crisis, but obviously particularly this one. First and foremost, this idea of having no choice but to change. And I think this is quite interesting, particularly from a psychological perspective. If one thinks about the mindset that a business owner, leader, employee finds themselves in, it's really difficult when you're being forced to do something that, whether you agree with or not, is not necessarily what was on your plan. And so people might, I guess, lean towards more of a loss than a gain mindset here, and it becomes a kind of loss versus gain thought pattern in businesses' minds, which is tricky to manage, and one needs to be very careful about how that mindset starts to affect your communication, your stakeholder relationships, your employee relationships, and obviously therefore your culture. The second most important challenge, I think, is this idea of system swirl and not swing. So if one pictures a swing in a park and you're pushing someone back and forth with kind of a different level of intensity, and that intensity predicts the level of the swing, business is typically like that, right? If it's well run, where you know what's coming if you invest in certain things or you market in a particular way. And there should be some predictability to a business. But what we're seeing around us at the moment is much more akin to a scene from Money Heist, where someone's dropped a big bag of cash from the top of a roof and the wind swirls up and people are grabbing at notes left, right, and center, trying to latch on and catch the next piece of cash or opportunity. So it feels a bit like that at the moment. And I think that the challenge for businesses to zoom out as far as possible, not take your time doing that, but do that quickly and look at the component parts of your value chain and see where perhaps there are opportunities for you to make the greatest impact, and where in the value chain can you redirect your efforts and focus rather than on perhaps trying to be efficient right across the board and then landing up doing all the wrong things perfectly. The third thing I wanted to speak about here as a challenge is organizations' values coming into question. And we know that values have been brought into sharp focus through this particular crisis that we've been in, this period we've been in, and not just because of the prioritization of self-care, but also more invisible issues and things like boundary setting, the difference between work and home life, and managing that balance carefully. I guess the leveling of roles with everyone being in the same boat, and the kind of flattening of hierarchy, and corporations being held to account for the claims that they're making in terms of the good that they're doing, and people calling them out for lack of authenticity, as opposed to the posture that they're making. And I think this kind of connects into Kuhle's point about staying woke and being connected to audiences, but also what Kudzi mentioned about being plugged into audiences, understanding and appreciating what conversations are going on in the moment. So given that there are three big decisions that businesses typically face in a crisis, and this is just my point of view, and welcome any challenge and a conversation around these. But the first is, do we shift to first gear or fifth gear? And I think that's a natural immediate reaction for organizations to make, is to think about bottom line preservation. And that's very much a first gear move. Whereas you see other organizations actually thinking about brand building. And I love the example of Chicken Lick, and I think that's a really good one, where not being able to trade, they've communicated around an ideology and bringing people together around a belief system, which I think is very powerful. South African Tourism have done the same thing. And I think, Kuzi's point around staying present and not just focusing on efficiency, but actually building brands in this environment is really, really important. Compliance mindset, yes, a very important thing. We need to comply. We need to follow the rules, but at the same time, we need to seek opportunity. And we can't just be compliant. We also need to find new growth profit pools, new growth relationship opportunities, etc. And I really like what Discovery did over the lockdown period, and I can speak to this firsthand, them being a client of mine, but the ability for them to accelerate their value proposition development during this period and deliver things like online doctor consultations for people even broader than their own client base, and wellness and healthy content series delivered to your home, etc. for home life, were really quick off the mark and did a really, really good job. And then a what if when mindset and a what if now mindset. So I heard a bank CEO on the Bruce Whitfield show earlier this week talking about put away your Gantt charts and focus on making decisions. So in previous years, perhaps, or previous months, or before the pandemic, people might have spent a lot of time in meetings talking about planning, but actually making decisions very, very quickly becomes the order of the day. And I really like what Siemens did here globally, actually reacting very quickly and making, by working the base policy for how they manage or how staff are allowed to work or encouraged to work rather from home. The second big question is about partnerships and people. And I think that there's some very difficult decisions, obviously, that we need to make as business in this environment. How do we keep people? How do we keep remunerating people? How do we keep motivating people? And I think what's very, very important is in this context for us to think about how we use data for demand creation and relationship building. And sadly, a bit of a negative here is what I've seen in many examples is people using data for outbound selling to try and sell more offers to people more often, rather than thinking about how they can use it for more engagement and relationship and conversation building. I think that talks to thinking about relationships and service redesign. Can one think in this environment about how one could be better at delivering your service? And if you've flown in the last couple of weeks on an airline, which I have had the opportunity to do this week, I thought Safe's response was quite incredible, with all the relationship correspondence and the guidance around helping you through navigating the new airport conditions and onboard safety, etc. I thought the communication was really good in the way that they have handled that. And the third point here is about speed, and this has been called, I guess, the great acceleration, the time of great acceleration. And both Kudzi and Kusha spoke of speed, but there are two ways to get people to speed up, and one can instruct them to do so, or one can motivate them appropriately and orchestrate. And I think speed should be an outcome of motivation and orchestration. Better effectiveness in terms of how we work together, not just inside organizations, but across our entire value chains. And I guess that also links into this third point around prioritizing our social responsibilities. And sadly, this is one thing which some organizations might immediately cut if they have or they don't have triple bottom line thinking or shared value thinking or inclusive thinking baked into their operating model. But it's really important that we ensure that the kind of good we're doing is not just about us talking about our purpose and what we stand for as organizations, but actually showing how we can create movement or progress in people's lives, how we can add more meaning to the products and services that they're consuming from us, and perhaps provide them with more mastery, self-service, more of an ability to be able to have greater control over their lives in an environment where perhaps control is taken away. Also, stakeholder participation across the value chain, and this is something which I think is a really useful conversation to have with people in your organization. How do you think about the conversations and opportunities that could be created by collective decision making with all stakeholders in your value? Can you get together and think about new ideas of how you can collaborate to deliver better, greater solutions or solutions with greater good to those customers that you already have and those prospects that you wish to have? And perhaps things like linking your operating model or your purpose more clearly to your enterprise development initiatives, to your supplier development programs, to your skill development programs are really important in terms of building a greater ecosystem of effect, rather than, as I mentioned earlier, just focusing on, I guess, staying profitable. That's really, really important, but one needs to do this at the same time and make sure one's looking for growth solutions through incremental opportunity. And then looking at your for good initiatives, looking at your contributions from a CSR foundation, or even if you're an organization that's that progressive, your shared value capability, how are you organizing that to address more systemic issues? How are you looking at the cause rather than the symptoms and focusing that effort more upstream so that it has more of a trickle-down effect and more ripple effect throughout your value chain and across your partner and client relationships? And so just to recap the 3 points that I've spoken to, we have to have an and not an or mindset. We have to protect the bottom line, yes, but we have to grow at the same time, and we have to keep seeking opportunity. We have to think that about our people as the answer, and not just our the people in our immediate employ, but people in our entire value chain, in our entire system. And perhaps if we can, and we should, think about people in broader society as well, and how we bring them into our business philosophy and help at the same time through how we deliver our products and services in new and different ways. And then making purpose tangible, it not just being something which is a statement, but rather something which is felt by individuals in a more practical way, through delivery in the moment of what's needed right now, because it's addressing a more systemic issue and not just a symptom. And so with all of that in mind, I think that the businesses that will do well inside a crisis are those that don't just try and maintain their brands, don't just try and maintain the category conditions and their competitive stature within it, but actually try and progress the category and move it forward while doing all those other things, making sure that there is more to the category than existed before the crisis. Thank you.
David, thank you so very much for providing that. I love seeing how there's a thread developing between the three speakers and the points that you've raised and the tips and insights that you've shared. And David, I think your final slide actually beautifully sums up the gist of what we're speaking about today. We're going to move into the discussion session. So I'm going to ask that our speakers You can unmute yourself. Although the question is going to be directed at one of you, you can feel free to add to the response of the discussion. We received 23 questions from our RSVP list, and from there we selected 3 relevant questions. We found that some of the questions that were raised, we felt confident that it would have been adequately responded to by the speakers, or that some of these questions could be answered by revisiting the previous Vega virtual talks we've loaded onto our website. So if you submitted questions, please have a look if it related to things like communication or leadership or your team-based questions. Please go have a look at the previous talks. We also found that there were quite a few people that spoke about the new normal, and I knew that David is going to address that, so I thought that was already answered to. And I think that that notion of new normal is on everybody's mind at the moment, trying to make sense of things. So, Krishna, you're going to be up first, and Samantha particularly wanted to ask you this question, so I felt it only right to put this in. She said she would first like to thank you and Kanta for the amazing insights you are producing during this time. And then the question was, how often, there's 2 questions really here, how often are you tracking insights on consumer behavior shifts in the country? And are your findings mostly based on the upper end of the market, or are they inclusive and representative across markets, and thus providing a general impression of the South African market? Gusli, what do you think?
To answer her first question, by definition, our business is continuously collecting insights from consumers. So that's happening on an ongoing basis, particularly for COVID-specific consumer shifts. That is also going on in an ongoing basis, and we've got one more round of value adds that we are providing to our clients that we've still yet to share. So it does cost the business money to continuously do the research nationally for free for our client base, but we found it was very important, and that's still ongoing. And I guess when you're asking the question about lower or upper end, we do mostly at this point in time online or mobile studies, because for safety reasons we cannot do face to face. And also I think outside of the pandemic, face to face is expensive. It is sometimes not safe, and I think mobile penetration is becoming a smaller problem as even consumers in rural areas are being connected through smartphones. Again, it links back to what I said around connectivity of cell phones allowing for higher penetration. So it is a national view. So we do cover the market, but I think at this point in time, a lot of the research that is happening is being done with a connected consumer. So that does go to the bottom of the market. But yeah, I guess given challenges with face-to-face, it is a connected consumer that we are mostly researching, but the country is open and we are revisiting face-to-face.
Okay. Kushli, I'd like to add to this, and maybe any one of you can respond, but Kushli, you work in this field particularly. And when we did the discussion, I actually noted here that we do deal quite a bit with the theme of, people first. You got to know your consumer. You have to be mindful that you may have a new competitor. The consumer behavior has shifted. And I wrote here that, a lot of this about understanding your consumer is to have empathy and develop an understanding of who these people are, how they feel, how they think, how they behave. Now, often a smaller business or maybe possibly budget limitations means that companies can't always afford having to, let's say, appoint a big research-based company to do research for them. Do you have any simple advice, being mindful of time? What could a business, a company do in order to try and gain some consumer insight? What would be the steps?
Yeah, I mean, just linked to what David was saying, a lot of the companies, the big ones, are providing free, national generic services. and studies. So don't be scared to, look at what's being offered for free. There's a lot of free stuff on the internet. The challenge is sifting through what's relevant and what's not. But I think the big industry players are making sure that, insights are available for the country and for clients, even small ones, and make use of small consultants. There are people with a lot of experience who are actually consulting, and they are targeting small businesses, but it's just really a matter of how do you find those people. And it is a small industry, so reach out. Samantha knows a lot of people who are freelancing. I know I'm a freelancer as well, so there are people with a lot of experience who can actually guide you. Even with budget limitations, there's lots of stuff for free
Fantastic.
that can be shared.
Super. Thank you for that, Kushli. And then Kutsia, I'm going to put you up next for question number 2. So along with the severe health and humanitarian crisis caused by the pandemic, executives around the world face enormous business challenges, such as the reduction of customer demand or significant regulatory parameters, supply chain interruptions, unemployment, the list is long, economic recession, and increased uncertainty. And like the health and humanitarian sides of the pandemic, the business side needs ways to recover. So question, what pertinent questions should business executives and directors be asking and trying to answer to ensure the survival of their business during and post the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the biggest question they have to ask is what are the changes in the consumer or customer's behavior? And then post that, drill it into how does that impact my business? Because so much has changed in the world. And 5 months is a long time, hey. A lot of behaviors are becoming sticky. People are going to stick with those new behaviors. So you've got to understand, first of all, what are the changes, as well as how does it impact you? And then once you know that, you will know as well how you need to shift in order to make sure you still meet the consumer's needs.
Okay, perfect, good. And I think it links with the question we're going to ask David. David, the question to you is: a significant socio-economic challenge, such as a pandemic, will in some way affect customer behavior, either permanently or temporarily. Shifting strategy in the wrong direction by addressing a temporary behavioral change versus something more long-term or permanent can be a costly mistake for business. So how do you go about developing a sustainable business strategy by keeping this in mind? What do you think?
Right. So I think, first and foremost, we need to figure out what's going to stick, right? And to do that, understanding what's temporary and what's not is, I would guess, the first important step. I laugh at that, by the way, because my Safari experience earlier in the week, I wish that seating arrangement thing, when you depart from the plane, would stick, right? Because now you've got to get up row by row. You're not this chaos of climbing over one another. So, but that's a silly example. I think there are other things which are much more important, and we can observe around us. And I think perhaps more observational research, perhaps more ethnography, would be important to kind of get to grips with what's going on in people's worlds, and making sure that we're clear around what should stick and what shouldn't, what people want to stick, in terms of changing, and then go upstream, right? Go upstream to the root causes of what you're involved in. So if you're involved in education, or if you're involved in health, or if you're involved, like from a business perspective, how do you go into the root issues of what I guess people are thinking about in respect to their livelihoods in this particular moment, in the crisis, rather than just doing generic things in education or generic things in health. Focus in on the particular issue. And then I think do more frequent business planning, right? 90-day cycles, not annual strategies.
Makes perfect sense. We had Ian Gorlay from one of the previous discussions actually made the comment that we now need to take our 5-year strategy and make it a 1 year. And now we go, maybe your 1 year needs to be your act it now, like what you said. What do we need? What if now versus what if when? It's been great chatting to all of you. I am going to allow one question to be asked by the participants. So if any of the participants would like to ask a question, you can put up your hand so I can see that you want to ask a question, and then you can unmute and actually ask your question. So if there's anybody on the chat here who would like to ask a question, please proceed and put up your hand. Okay, nobody wants to ask a question? Nothing. Is there anything from the panel that you'd like to contribute or conclude as part of our discussion today? Concluding thoughts.
Nothing from me. Thank you for having us.
It's been a great pleasure, Kutsi, Kushli, and David. It's been a very meaningful conversation. David, anything from you?
Yeah, Narita, just to say, I think, you know, it's difficult to stay optimistic, but we need to be optimistic. We've got to be thinking about, you know, managing the situation, but also growing at the same time. And it's amazing what, if you do just give time for reflection on how you can grow outside of your normal way of working or kind of typical business system, one can invent new and creative ways of creating opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, David. Then I am going to say this is the end of our Vega Virtual Talks, number 5, Business During a Pandemic. It's been absolutely great having David Kutsi and Kush involved, being the phenomenal people you are and the influence you have in the industry. Thank you for your partnership. Thank you for your time and your insight shared today. Really appreciate it. And then thank you to all the participants that also joined us today. Thank you very much, and do take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye.